Good evening, everyone. I am really excited to welcome you here tonight for a special rapid response webinar on the implications of the recent US military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. And I'm super excited that we were able to put this program together on such short notice because many of you have been reaching out to us with questions and concerns about the sudden escalation in the region. And we're really lucky that we have such a well-known and respected we had such a well-known and well-respected non-proliferation expert join our board just a couple weeks ago, Professor Rebecca Davis Gibbons from USM. For those of you who don't know her, she is an associate professor of political science at our partner institution, the University of Southern Maine, and she's also a leading voice on nuclear non-proliferation. For those of you who haven't read her book on the US relationship in the US leadership in the global non-proliferation regime, which is called the Hegemon's Toolkit, I really recommend that you check it out. It's an excellent basis for understanding some of these questions that we're going to get into tonight. And her research has also appeared, she's been published very widely in different journals, and her research has also appeared in major outlets like the Washington Post and The Hill. She's a long-standing member of the World Affairs Council of Maine. And also leads the Maine Model UN Conference. A lot of her students, many of whom are on this program tonight, hi guys, have come on board as our student interns. And in addition to that, I don't know if there are enough hours in the day for someone to realistically do all these things, but she has also worked on arms control policy. And long before she became an academic, she even taught in the Marshall Islands. And I'm super excited. One of the benefits of having such a well-known non-proliferation expert on our board is that she has the capacity to identify and drag in equally fascinating and well-knowledged individuals, such as our second guest, Mr. Sam Lair, who is a research associate at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies in California. Among the many things that he does, he uses open source intelligence and satellite imagery to assess different nuclear sites and different military sites, evaluate their operational capability, identify perhaps some of their vulnerabilities, and understand, get a clear picture of some of the things that are happening on the ground. He's worked on everything from Cold War missile defense history to today's nuclear challenges, like the situation in Iran, but also North Korea. And I'm really excited to hear what his data and research will tell us about the impact of these strikes. And so just give me a second to move this thing out of my way here so I can have my notes in the right place. And we're going to get started right away with our first question, which I actually am going to bring to Sam to capitalize on his expertise here. Sam, as you and everybody on this program knows, we have seen a dramatic escalation in the Middle East, something that has been on the table for the last 4 US presidential administrations. I think we all remember John McCain and his little campaign ditty about bombing Iran, but it's something that was always pushed off the table or put on hold, potentially used as a bargaining chip, and that was the prospect of using these B-52 bombers and our bunker busting capability to actually strike these nuclear sites in Fordo and Natanz. And so I really would like to start with you and ask this really basic question. Where are we? What is the impact of these strikes, and what does the situation look like on the ground now and over the last few weeks?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm really excited to be here and to talk to everyone today about this. There's been a lot going on in Iran, and it's really difficult to follow all of it. This is my full-time job, and even I struggle. So it's really understandable that folks are interested in figuring out what's going on. And uh, in order to figure out where we are, and I know that Dr. Gibbons is going to talk about where we have been, but I'm going to go to like where we just were, and then we can kind of see why these strikes came about, what their consequences are. But so I'm going to start with the beginning of the conflict on June 13th. Um, this had been presaged by a bunch of various signals, which are much clearer in hindsight. This includes the evacuation of non-essential personnel from U.S. embassies across the Middle East, um, uh, families for military members who were in Gulf states, for example, were also ordered to leave. And then I think the most outrageous indication that a strike was about to happen is the U.S. ambassador to Israel tweeted out this like very ominous post about how he hoped everyone was going to be very safe and secure. And then about 40 minutes later, bombs started falling in Iran. So I guess Mike Huckabee kind of spoiled the surprise, which is interesting. But the Israeli strikes covered a wide variety of targets. And this is not the kind of strike that was envisioned when people talked about, for the past couple decades. This wasn't the strike that was envisioned when people talked about a attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. People were envisioning bunker buster munitions going after the hardened sites at Fordow and Natanz, as well as other nuclear supporting infrastructure like the research center in Esfahan and perhaps the reactors at Iraq and Bushehr. That wasn't what we saw. We saw some damage to Natanz, which I'll walk through some satellite images of in a little bit. But we didn't see any attacks at Fordow, partially because it's very deeply buried, and the Israelis would have a very difficult time digging it out, especially without U.S. assistance. But so, in addition to a kind of a very limited strike against Iranian nuclear targets, there were much more extensive strikes against Iranian ballistic missile facilities and bases and production complexes, as well as Iranian military leadership. There are some suggestions that political leadership was also targeted, but that's much less clear. What became very evident during the first hours after the strike was that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps leadership in particular was directly targeted. This included attacking residential complexes in Tehran, where the leadership was known to live. There were kind of very striking images of entire apartment complexes destroyed in the hours after the attacks. This campaign kind of escalated from there. There was widespread chaos amongst the Iranians, with good cause. It seems like more or less the entire upper echelon of Iranian military leadership was wiped out, or died shortly after that first strike on June 13. So the Iranians were kind of in disarray. Another thing to note is that Iranian air defenses really underperformed. While there were never any very high expectations for the capabilities of Iranian air defenses, considering that they never got what they wanted from the Russians, which was more sophisticated systems and in higher quantities. But there was a lot of skepticism about the capabilities of their domestically produced systems, especially from, including some reports that some of my colleagues and I produced. So the poor performance of Iranian air defenses was very striking, and Israel has had more or less uncontested air superiority since the start of the attack on the 13th. After that, the focus of the Israeli attacks shifted towards continuing to kind of attack leadership targets, but they were focused on suppressing the Iranian ballistic missile force while going after the production complexes for ballistic missiles, as well as some production facilities for nuclear related items. A lot of facilities associated with centrifuge production, for example, were attacked. But a really big focus of the attacks during the first week or so of the war was suppressing what my colleague Decker Eveleth referred to as kind of the first line of Iranian missile bases. So the bases near Tabriz got really, really hit hard, as well as bases in Karamabad and Kermanshah. These all kind of bore the brunt of the initial Israeli strikes. However, the Iranians began retaliating eventually. The delay in retaliation, it was probably a day or so before the Iranians struck back, that can probably be attributed to the severe command and control problems that they were facing, right? The entirety of their leadership got taken out. It wasn't until several days until the conflict that a new head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force was named after Hajidazade was killed during the first day. So once the Iranians began to kind of return fire against Israel, focusing on initially, it seemed like the Iranians focused their attack on IDF headquarters in northern Tel Aviv, then kind of spreading out their targets. It looks like some residential areas were targeted, industrial areas were certainly targeted. The refinery at Haifa was repeatedly targeted and a couple of times set on fire. But this kind of disarray in the Iranian retaliation is probably attributable in part to the command and control problems, also in part to the Israeli command of the airspace. One of the most striking things that have come out of the conflict is the kind of videos and accounts that have come mostly out of the Israeli Air Force, but also videos we've seen from Iranians on the ground of Israeli drones and Israeli aircraft striking Iranian mobile ballistic missile launchers, right? If folks remember the difficulty that the United States had during the Scud hunt in the 1991 Gulf War, this was one of the big problems that was associated with this type of military operation, was finding these.
Oops, Sam, I think your audio has gone out.
Hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, this was surprising to many, I think, because of the US experience during the Scud hunt during the 1991 Iraq War. And so the success that the Israelis have had in attacking the Iranians' ability to launch ballistic missiles, so not just kind of destroying the missiles themselves or attacking the bases, but attacking the things that can launch the missiles, that was really surprising to a lot of analysts, including myself. And again, I think this is attributable to that Israeli control of the airspace. As the kind of conflict extended into the second week, more and more Iranian missile bases in the second line of defense. So these are bases mostly in Isfahan, but also Shiraz, deeper into Iran. Those started getting attacked as well. We saw kind of extensive damage to both of the Iranian missile bases in Isfahan. And then various places in Shiraz were attacked, including an electronics complex, which is reported to make, I think, guidance components as well. So we see this kind of multi-pronged effort from the Israelis where they are suppressing the various Iranian missile bases. They're also attacking production sites. So there are many production sites for ballistic missiles near Tehran, a place called Bidganeh, a place called Kozhir, a place called Parchin. All of these have been attacked. But the most, I think, impressive part of the Israeli attack on the ballistic missile production infrastructure was that they finally attacked a missile production plant outside of Sharud, which is very deep into Iran. It's not that far from the border with Afghanistan. And so the Israeli ability to strike that deep into Iran is very impressive, but also the damage was very limited. So I think one of the kind of interesting parts about this is that while a ton of Iranian production infrastructure has been attrited over the past 2 weeks, some of the most significant new components of that infrastructure is still there and it hasn't been destroyed. And perhaps part of that is due to just how deep it is into Iran. On last Saturday, on the 21st, the United States finally enters the conflict. We had been providing Israel with assistance in intercepting ballistic missiles. We had deployed a terminal high altitude area defense battery to Israel in October. And then we also had guided missile destroyers with the Aegis system, also intercepting ballistic missiles from the Mediterranean. So we had been kind of helping the Israelis play defense, but this was the first offensive actions the United States had taken during the conflict, which was Operation Midnight Hammer. And that involved 30 Tomahawk cruise missiles from a guided missile submarine somewhere in, I think, the Arabian Sea, as well as B-2 stealth bombers flying from the continental United States, delivering the massive ordnance penetrator bunker buster munition to the hardened Iranian nuclear sites. So the cruise missiles went to an above ground facility at a place called Isfahan. and then the bunker buster munitions went to Fordo and Natanz. And I have some images that I can share of. Great. Okay. So this is the facility at Natanz. And this was a couple of days after the Israeli strike on it, on the 13th, but it kind of gives you a bigger overview so that you can have a better sense of what the site looks like. So you have these underground enrichment halls, which were a cut and cover operation. Basically, the Iranians dug out a bunch of dirt, built a bunch of buildings, then put the dirt back over them, which is why it looks all lumpy. And there's a bunch of support infrastructure and other kind of centrifuge production, research, things like that around there. And we can see the various parts of the complex that the Israelis destroyed in the 13th strike. And now that we've kind of oriented a bit, let's see, come on. Okay, so this is from the day after the Israeli strike, and an electrical substation was attacked. This is reported to have affected the power going to the centrifuges, which would have, I'm not a centrifuge expert, but my understanding is that centrifuges don't like it when the uranium hexafluoride is allowed to sit in there for a long time and is not warmed, and it starts causing all sorts of problems. Similarly, HVAC and support infrastructure was destroyed. And then a pilot centrifuge plant, which was being used to enrich to 60% above ground, was destroyed by the Israelis as well. The joke was that the IAEA could wipe that off of their safeguards list. But the actual enrichment halls buried underneath Natanz were not targeted, which was notable. This is a photo after the day after the United States strike, and this is over those enrichment halls again. And this time we can see that there is a very large crater there. This is probably the product of two of those massive ordnance penetrator bunker buster munitions. If anyone has seen the documentary Top Gun Maverick, it's very similar to that, where you drop one to kind of burrow into the dirt, and then you drop another to kind of finish the job. It's unclear how much damage this did, especially since the damage from the kind of loss of power and the attacks to the rest of the complex are still unassessed. The IAEA Director General, Rafael Grossi, said that there was pretty significant damage to the facility. And I'm sure that this did not make it better, but this is also kind of thought to be only part of the underground enrichment hall. There's another one a little bit above this, which might not have been impacted. This is one of the kind of problems that we have with satellite imagery interpretation and analysis of these strikes, is that since they're buried, deeply buried targets, we can see what's going on above ground, but we're going to need someone to actually go in there, hopefully the IAEA, and take a look around themselves before we can come to any definitive conclusions. And this becomes really significant when we look at Fordo, which is buried under a mountain instead of kind of the cut and cover thing. So Fordo is a much more recent site. It was, I think, started around 2006 or 2007. It was unveiled during the Obama administration. And this is a photo from after the initial round of Israeli strikes. And the striking thing about this photo is there's no damage here. The Israelis didn't even try to strike it. None of the tunnel entrances are damaged. None of the above ground support facilities are damaged. And there were a bunch of different ways to interpret this. One was that, perhaps the Israelis were much more focused on Iranian leadership targets. Another is that they just know their limitations and they knew that they couldn't go after the deeply buried target themselves. And that's why they were so interested in getting the United States involved, because we were the only ones who could deliver the munitions to attack this facility. This is a photo from the day before the US strikes, and we're kind of getting more information about this slowly, but it's clear that there was back and forth between the Iranian government and the Trump administration about whether there was going to be a strike, something like that. But I think that this image suggests that the Iranians had read the tea leaves of whether or not the US was kind of interested in participating, and they had decided to take some proactive measures. We can see that these are trucks that are kind of burying the tunnel entrances to help try to protect them from any attack on the facility. It's also thought that any kind of enriched uranium and perhaps some components were removed from the site. But again, it's hard to be sure about this. But so the Iranians took precautions. This is the day after the strike. And so we can see that there are kind of three different clusters of massive ordnance penetrator impacts So again, 14 of these munitions were used overall during the strike. Two each for six of these suggests that 12 were used to attack this facility. The reason why this part of the mountain was chosen is because satellite imagery, both during the construction of the facility and since the construction, suggested that there was some sort of ventilation complex near here. And so that would have made the job of the bunker busters easier. But you'll notice that, right, there's no like very easy to see like comedy-sized fireball or crater. And again, this goes back to like, this looks like a damaged facility to me. I'm sure that vent isn't going to work anymore. But again, we won't know the extent of the damage until someone goes in there. Um, but I mean, my thought is that if I had 12, 2,500-pound bombs dropped on me, my facility would probably not be working too well afterwards. And we know that centrifuge enrichment facilities are especially sensitive to things like shock and vibration. So it's likely that some damage was, done to Fordo, but again, the extent is unclear. The Israelis showed up a couple of days later and destroyed a bunch of the buildings above ground and cratered one of the entrances. Some of the reporting I saw about this was that this perhaps was to prevent response teams from going in and starting to dig things out. But it's kind of unclear what happened, but the IDF did claim responsibility for the attack. So we know that the Israelis thought that there were some targets that they wanted to hit, and they went and got them. One of the facilities that has kind of been less talked about is the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Research Center, which has a bunch of really important facilities here. One is a uranium conversion facility that takes yellow cake uranium and it turns it into the uranium hexafluoride gas that you then put into a centrifuge to take it from natural uranium, which is like 0.7% of the stuff you need to make a bomb, to 90% of the stuff you need to make a bomb. So you're trying to enrich uranium-235. You use that using uranium-235 gas. The way you get that gas is the conversion facility. There are a bunch of different things that are here, but kind of on the other end or the north end of this complex, the fuel plate fabrication plant, there are a bunch of different ways this is talked about. It also produces zirconium for cladding fuel rods, but the kind of upper part of the facility is where they can take that gas and turn it into uranium metal. That's kind of the most important part. And so this is, the Israelis did not attack this until the second day of the war. And you can see that they kind of damaged some things. I'll go back and forth so that you all can kind of see the damage. But mostly the uranium conversion facility was attacked, right? So the Israelis were attacking the ability of the Iranians to make more hexafluoride gas. And then a week later, it was attacked again. And this time, the fuel fabrication plant was also targeted. So there's a kind of really large area that was damaged. Since this happened the day before the American strikes, a lot of this damage was actually attributed to the US Tomahawks. But, we don't want to give ourselves too much credit. We want to make sure that we apportion destruction appropriately. And then this is after the US strike, and we've kind of tried to highlight who targeted which parts of the facility. But this facility has been pretty severely impacted by the 3 rounds of strikes. The fuel conversion or the uranium conversion plant is probably out of action for a long time, as well as the zirconium production and fuel production plant. So these are kind of very important parts of the industrial process to make the fissile material that would go into a weapon that have been severely attrited by the attacks. So even if the Iranians are able to reestablish kind of a centrifuge enrichment program, resolving this is also going to be an impediment that has to be resolved. However, there's nothing that difficult about these, right? It's basically industrial chemical processes. Any kind of modern industrial nation can do this. The Iranians were very capable of doing this. It's just a matter of time. And then I think one of the things we'll be talking about more in the near future is how sneaky they are about doing it. And yeah, that's it.
That's fascinating, Sam. I mean, I think the overview is really important, and the level of detail gives us clarity in terms of what happened. But I really appreciate you outlining that what the impact of that is not clear without our ability to to have eyes on the ground, which of course is that much harder without the IAEA being present. And speaking of the IAEA, I want to turn to Rebecca, because I'd like to, all of this has happened very, very quickly. There's been a lot of talk for years about, Iran can't have a bomb and this is bad, and all of these kinds of things, which are understandable from a political perspective. But I think it's really important for us to understand, how did we get to this point where Iran having the possibility of Iran having a nuclear weapon is considered so serious that we would have to have US missile strikes? And why would Iran be so adamant that they have the right to enrich uranium and continue to pursue that within a regional context? Can you give us a better understanding of how we got to this point?
Yes, and thank you for having me, and thank you, Sam. That was fabulous. Love to talk to you more about this. In order to explain how we got here, I'm going to split this into three really brief sections. So first, I want to talk about the rules that we have in the international system regarding nuclear weapons and nuclear technology, and then I want to talk about Israel's role historically and today, and then talk at the end about the conflict over the past years about the Iranian nuclear program. So first, just so we all understand how we got here, we need to know about these rules that govern nuclear technology and nuclear weapons. And the most important aspect of those rules is the 1970 Treaty on the Nonproliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT. This was a treaty that was created in the late 60s to prevent additional states from, or additional countries from developing their own nuclear weapons program. So this was a treaty that was largely negotiated by the Soviet Union and the US for strategic reasons, but other countries participated as well. This treaty creates two classes or two tiers of states. So we have 5 nuclear weapon states in the treaty. They're considered official nuclear weapon states in the international system. They got to be in this sort of privileged place because they had tested nuclear weapons by January 1st of 1967. So that was the US and the Soviet Union, now Russia as the inheritor nation, China, the UK, and France. And so all other countries that decided they would join this treaty, who had an interest in nonproliferation, preventing, more and more states from having these weapons, would have to join as non-nuclear weapon states. So non-nuclear weapon states, they're not allowed to build, possess these weapons, but they are allowed to have peaceful nuclear technology, which gets back to something that Allison just said, Iran saying it has a right. Well, under this treaty, under the NPT, they are supposed to have access to peaceful nuclear technology. And this is where we get into the real challenge with these rules, with the NPT, with this argument with Iran, is that we have this dual use challenge when it comes to nuclear technology. The same technology that can be used for peaceful means to help develop fuel to put in nuclear reactors for energy can also be used to make nuclear weapons. So it's not as easy as just banning a whole class of technology, because non-nuclear weapon states are supposed to have the access to this peaceful technology. So that's where Iran's idea of this right comes in. I think the best case to show the challenge here is North Korea. North Korea used to be in the NPT and was provided with so-called peaceful nuclear technology. It pulled out of the treaty in 2003, and then, as we know, went on to use that same technology to build a nuclear weapons program. Importantly, the NPT requires non-nuclear weapon states to maintain safeguards agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. If you are reading the New York Times or Washington Post or kind of any other um, popular media, they just call them the nuclear watchdogs, which I found to be interesting. Sometimes you don't even see IAEA or International Atomic Energy Agency. They're just called the nuclear watchdogs. But this is the agency based in Vienna that goes in and sends inspectors to check on the nuclear facilities and the nuclear material in non-nuclear weapon states to try to detect if they have diverted any nuclear material for non-peaceful purposes. And so that matters a lot today for where we are with Iran. I also need to point out before moving on to my second point that there are 5 countries today that are not in this treaty, only 5. So as I said before, North Korea withdrew, but had been a member. Then we have India and Pakistan, both nuclear weapon states, have never joined this treaty. Israel is also a nuclear weapon state that has never joined this treaty. And then the other state is South Sudan, which is the newest state in the international system. And I imagine that at some point they will join the treaty. Okay, so that's the major global rules that we have. We have the NPT, we have the safeguards agreement that are uh, put in place and operationalized by the International Atomic Energy Agency. So now let's talk briefly about Israel's role. Um, we know Israel has nuclear weapons, but it maintains this policy of nuclear opacity or nuclear ambiguity, by which its leaders do not talk about having nuclear weapons. But we believe that they have had some operational capability with nuclear weapons since the late 1960s. Today, Israel has a triad of delivery vehicles. It can deliver nuclear weapons by aircraft, by submarines, and by missiles. Now, why does it have this policy of ambiguity? One of the reasons is that it had an agreement with the Nixon administration that it would have this policy. And I think in part it fulfills US nonproliferation goals, because by not declaring it openly, it dampens the proliferation pressures of other states around it, right? So Israel has had a lot of conflict with its neighbors. If it talks openly about its nuclear capability, maybe Saudi Arabia, maybe Egypt over time, historically would have wanted to develop these weapons in response. Israel has been very aggressive in preventing its neighbors from obtaining nuclear weapons. So the 2 big examples we have are in 1981, Israeli jets bombed a nuclear reactor in Iraq. This is in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. There was no nuclear material yet in that reactor, but the Israelis feared that Saddam Hussein would use that reactor to eventually develop plutonium for a nuclear weapon. The big question I think that's important here is, did this stop Saddam's program, right? The bombing of this reactor? The answer is no, right? So Saddam decided to take the uranium enrichment route from that point and had a hidden program for a decade until inspectors learned about it after the Gulf War in 91. So Israel destroying the reactor did not stop Saddam Hussein from pursuing some kind of nuclear program. The other example is in 2007, Israeli forces bombed a reactor that was under construction in Syria. The concern there was it seemed a lot like the North Korean reactor. They even have photos of North Korean workers there. And so it was thought that the Assad regime was trying to maybe follow in the footsteps of North Korea. Of course, the attacks that Sam just described are much more in depth and broad than these attacks I'm talking about, but there is a history of a history of Israel trying to prevent others in its neighborhood. It wants to have the nuclear monopoly in its neighborhood. In terms of academic literature on attacking these programs, there's not a lot of cases to draw from. What we do know, and the evidence that's out there, is these attacks delay the nuclear program, but the effect is rather modest. And I think that seems pretty consistent with what we're hearing, at least from the US intelligence community, the DIA report that came out that said, oh, maybe this is delaying them by months, which is not that long, right? Okay, so lastly, I just want to talk briefly about the Iranian program. The Iranian program began under the Shah. So the previous government, the Shah was in power until the 1979 revolution, the Islamic Revolution, which brought about the current government. The Shah was a beneficiary of the US Atoms for Peace program. So in the 1950s and 1960s, the US thought, we're going to share this technology with other countries and help provide reactors and nuclear material. The Soviets at the time said, this might not be a good idea. But we did it anyway, and then they did it too. And it is true that it is not a good idea in many cases. The Shah planned to have something like 20 nuclear power reactors. Some people looked at that and thought maybe that would be problematic, but the Shah was a partner of the US. The Shah joined the NPT in 1970. And when he talked about why he did this, he saw this as something that he recognized that this was very important to the US government. And of course it was. In 1979, we have the Islamic Revolution that brings about this new government, and they early on reject nuclear technology. This is associated with kind of the past regime that they don't want to be a part of. But by the mid 80s, they are looking at nuclear technology again. They're in the 8-year war with Iraq, right? This is the longest conventional war of last century. They become a customer of the A.Q. Khan network. A.Q. Khan was an important person within the Pakistani nuclear program, and he eventually created this network around the globe to provide plans and equipment in a black market, essentially, to customers around the world. So Iran was one of the customers of this network. The recent history that we're talking about now, the crisis really begins in 2002 when an Iranian group in the United States against the regime reveals that Iran has these secret nuclear facilities. And here we're talking about Iraq with an A and Natanz, that they were undeclared to the IAEA, right? They should have been declared to the nuclear watchdogs and they weren't. And so here Iran seems out of compliance with its NPT commitments. At this point, when it's discovered, Iran's leadership says, okay, we'll stop doing enrichment. That was 2003. When Ahmadinejad, if you remember, he became president, a more hardliner in the relative spectrum of politics in Iran. He starts enriching uranium again in 2005. This leads to years of sanctions by the UN Security Council, by the US, by European nations, a lot of rounds of sanctions over the next decade. In 2009, it's revealed that there was another secret facility, and this is that Fordo, that deeply buried in the mountain facility that Sam talked about. Eventually, the Obama administration is able to begin negotiations with Iran. Russia, China, Germany, the UK, and France are also part of those negotiations that result in the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So you hear it referred to as the JCPOA and most often as the Iran nuclear deal. And so under this deal, Iran agrees to dismantle much of its nuclear program. It's going to have even more stringent inspections from inspectors from the IAEA in exchange for sanctions relief. This happened once it has a more moderate president, Rouhani, who's elected in 2015. Now, we know in the United States, this deal received a lot of criticism, mostly on the right, and in part because it limited the program, but it had some clauses that sunset. So certain clauses were only going to last 10 years or 15 years. But the key goal of the Iran nuclear deal was to give us a year of time if Iran's government made the political decision to build nuclear weapons. So we would have what we call breakout time. We would have a year of breakout time, right? That's what the goal that was the goal. And I'd point out that now we maybe have months, right? Months. Trump came to power, and as promised in his campaign, he got rid of the deal in May of 2018. The Iranian regime actually waited almost a full year before it started taking actions that went against the deal. But slowly it started to increase the amount of uranium that enriched. It increased the level of enrichment, where now Iran has a significant quantity of uranium that is enriched to 60%. We consider weapons grade to be 90%. It is the step from 60 to 90 is not that big of a jump. And so it is concerning how much enriched uranium they have, which we think that they probably moved to a place that wasn't bombed, could have been moved to a place that wasn't bombed before the attacks. The Biden administration tried to revive a deal, wasn't able to. And so now we're at this place. The IAEA has again, on June 12th, declared that Iran was in noncompliance with its obligations. And again, I want to point out that Trump is trying to pursue diplomacy now when we have less time in terms of breakout than we did when we had the deal. So, I mean, as I don't want to harp on this too much, but it is frustrating to hear coverage over and over again. I wish every time there was a news story, they'd say like, "Oh, by the way, we did have this. Diplomacy was working, right? It wasn't, it wasn't, it didn't have to be the case that we got to military action, right? Necessarily, but here we are. So I will stop there, and I appreciate everyone listening.
Thank you for that really important overview, both of the international regulatory framework, which I think is critically important in terms of understanding where Iran is and where a lot of its rhetoric about its rights are grounded, but also this diplomatic trajectory that provided a potential, an opportunity to bring Iran back into, the good standing among the nations, a good player in the neighborhood, and the implications of our withdrawal from that deal in terms of shortening the breakup time. So now we're here. And one thing you didn't mention is also that during this time, of course, and in the, real immediate history in the last year and a half or so, Israel has also, really reshaped the political balance of power in the Middle East. I mean, one of the important criticisms of the JCPOA was that it did a really good job of restraining Iran's nuclear program and checking their ambitions, giving us that breakout time, but it did nothing about their support for their various regional proxies. I know that that was a significant complaint of the Sunni Arab states in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia, particularly Jordan. So that whole landscape has changed, and we're here at this, really critical tipping point. And, I want to ask both of you, where are we going? Because when I'm looking at the landscape, it really looks like we have a very narrow path to some sort of a negotiated agreement that would have to include some arrangement where Iran can say they're still able to maintain their right to a peaceful nuclear program. I mean, I know there are these schemes to sort of have enrichment in one country, production in, a kind of a regional consortium, and to get Israel on board at a time where it sees that perhaps it really does have the opportunity to reshape the Middle East in a way that, suits its political aspirations and its vision of security. And so I don't know how we could potentially square that. And then we see these, other potential for the US to be drawn in, potential for there to be a long war of attrition, or perhaps the most frightening scenario is that because, as Sam, showed us, because they've had the opportunity to move so much of this material, that perhaps they're actually going to say, you know what, we learned we got to get this bomb and get it quickly. And so we could potentially see Iran withdraw from the NPT and perhaps get as far as a nuclear test, which would kind of be the nightmare scenario that all of this was meant to prevent, right? So I want to ask both of you, where are we potentially going diplomatically, in terms of international law, and also in terms of like physically what could happen given the capabilities in the region and what we saw on the ground after these strikes? And I'll let either of you start.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. So I mean, the recent news that in the past hour, right, is that the Trump administration says they're going to resume talks with Iran next week, but then Trump also said he doesn't care if they get a deal or not. So I think that's sort of confusing. I mean, if he's being consistent with this line that he's obliterated the program, so we don't need a deal. But I mean, I think the evidence suggests that countries can rebuild and that the breakout time is still in a matter of months. Um, in terms of leaving the NPT, I mean, that was something Iran used to disavow and not take seriously. But in recent years, people in government have taken that idea, have been more comfortable talking about that. So that's a real concern. I think the discussion of regime change makes me more concerned that they would go in the direction of proliferation. I mean, when you think I'm really glad that you, Allison, you brought up that point about the landscape has changed, right? I mean, we really like the new Middle East post October 7th, right? Is where we are. And I think that's one of the reasons that Israel was comfortable bombing is because Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, they've all been weakened, right? And those proxies. And so Israel is kind of seizing on this opportunity to do this, but the conversation and saying regime change, I mean, if I say, do you want to be Gaddafi? Do you want to be Saddam Hussein? Or do you want to be Kim Jong-un? Right? You want to be Kim Jong-un, right? And so what's the lesson? What's the precedent there? Having nuclear weapons prevents countries from coming in and doing regime change. And so you could see, I mean, I tend to think that this increases their desire to want to get a nuclear weapon instead of doing the opposite. And I know we're close to time, so I'll let Sam answer and then we can try to do some questions.
Thanks,
Um,
Rebecca. Sam?
Yeah, if I knew what was going to happen, I would be buying way more lottery tickets. I think that one thing that I've kind of taken away from the past couple of weeks is there is a lot of potential for really unanticipated things to happen. And certain predictions are I'd be wary of kind of making very certain predictions. There are a couple of things that I think are important. Dr. Gibbons mentioned the stockpile of kind of already enriched uranium. Iranians have a stockpile of about 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. I've heard from a fairly authoritative source that you can make a bomb out of 60% enriched uranium. And also, if you enriched it to the full 90%, that's worth, 9 or 10 weapons. And the really concerning thing is that that material is no longer under safeguards and we don't know where it is. JD Vance admitted as such after the attack. And that's really concerning to me. Another thing is I think that the Iranians do have a pretty decent ability to reconstitute their program, though I would be hard pressed to put a number on it. But I think one thing that's worth tracking is that the day that the war started and the day that the Israelis began attacking, the IAEA censored Iran or declared it out of compliance with its safeguards agreement. And in retaliation for this, or in response, the Iranians announced that they had completed a third site for uranium enrichment, similar to Natanz and Fordow. They had not installed centrifuges there, but they were going to start doing so, and that it was even more secure than Fordow, right? So the 200 meters of rock on top of Fordow, because it's a mountain, this one's even more secure than that. And so my concern is that the Iranians will be able to take the centrifuges they have, reconstitute a program at this third site, and then resume enrichment. Again, a lot of the other things that are important for a nuclear program, like conversion and fuel and metal fabrication, those have been destroyed, but they're industrial processes. They're chemical and industrial processes that are available to every nation, every kind of, advanced modern nation, which Iran absolutely is. So, I'm not going to like make a guess about whether or not Iran will have bomb or do a test. I don't know, but the capacity is there, especially in light of the Pentagon report that Dr. Gibbons mentioned, which suggests that maybe these attacks actually did very little damage. And then, yeah, one final thing is in terms of U.S. capability, the really big bunker busters that we used, that was the majority of our stockpile. We don't have that many of them, and it probably takes a while to make them because it takes a while to make anything these days. But like our ability to go after those very buried targets is very limited now. We tried doing the kind of hard military action, and it seems like it hasn't been particularly effective. It set it back a couple of months, whereas the JCPOA set back things at minimum 10 years.
That's a perfect tee up for one of the audience questions. I mean, I think it's really important for all of us to sort of sit for a minute with the reality that you laid out, Sam, that, we've potentially exhausted our capability to reach these sites, but it's also pretty clear that we didn't do the damage that we potentially needed to do if we were going to take out the program. And so we were in this really vulnerable space. And our program chair, Professor Muller, has asked here, there's two general schools of thought on how you basically prevent nuclear proliferation. The use of hard power, which we've just seen had some effectiveness, but maybe not enough effectiveness, and diplomacy. And what should the balance be between these two? And I want to throw another angle in here about the importance of international conventions like the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty in that balance, and what potential impact these strikes have had on that, as a useful tool in encouraging diplomacy. And Rebecca, I think, that can go to you.
Thank you, Julie, for the difficult question. I mean, I think a short answer would be I was more comfortable from 2015 to when Trump left the JCPOA than I am today. And so that was diplomacy, but I wouldn't ever say that that was diplomacy in a silo, right? I mean, it was backed by the potential threat of Israel attacking at some point because they have a track record of doing that from the US. I mean, there were people in the US talking about what it would look like to try to take out the Iranian nuclear program. So I do think they work in a hand in hand. And I mean, I see the NPT as flawed, but overall quite effective and successful. And it's created these norms and rules and it is an institution, but it is backed by the hard power of the US. So of course, I'm going to say I can't disaggregate those two things from one another. But having an institution instead of having to operate bilaterally with each of these cases, I think it makes it less costly and more effective. Sam, do you want to add to that?
Just to kind of emphasize or foot stomp something that Dr. Gibbons said is, yeah, diplomacy is totally backed by kind of military force and kind of the threat to use it. And one of the concerns that I have is that I think it's quite clear that if a deal is achieved at this point, it's not going to be as good as the JCPOA. I think part of that is because the kind of hard counterproliferation strategy has been a little discredited by the Israeli and the American efforts. Right? That threat isn't as credible as it was when we just kind of kept it in our back pocket and didn't use it. And it reminds me of kind of something that became something the Biden administration harped on all the time, which was integrated deterrence. But I actually think it's a useful concept here, which is like integrated deterrence is the integration of all aspects of national power, be they diplomatic, be they military, be they economic. And I think that's one of the reasons why the JCPOA happened, is that we were able to integrate all of those different aspects of American power into producing an agreement that was pretty effective. And it's unclear whether or not all three of those kind of elements of American power will be as available for a future agreement with Iran.
Can I add? I just want to add briefly that I do think that the Obama administration, because Obama's first speech on international politics in Prague, he advanced the vision for a world without nuclear weapons, and that gave him a lot of goodwill. That's he kind of got the anticipatory peace prize because of that, the Nobel Peace Prize. And so I think that the kind of hope that he would make a change and the goodwill that that provided, and trying to take some other concrete actions as well, was what allowed him to be successful in bringing the EU 3+3 or the P5+1, however you want to say it, together to negotiate the JCPOA. So there was kind of a sense of global goodwill and hope that we don't have right now to try to advance that diplomatic track.
Which I think gets back to why this integrative deterrence, I'm really glad that you brought that up, is so important. And I'm laughing at some of the questions that came in because I guess I'm not the only grumpy realist in the room. And so I think it's important to ask a question that never gets asked because of the politics around it. But why would it be so terrible if Iran had a nuclear weapon? channeling Ken Waltz here, if Iran has a nuclear weapon, you could make the argument that the reason the Middle East is so unstable is because you have one nuclear power in that regional complex. And that creates a situation in which everybody is nervous and feels the need to have chemical weapons, to have all of these, other capacities to arm proxies, because they recognize that there's no way to have real deterrence in that situation. So why not just let Iran have the bomb and have a sort of bipolar Middle East?
Sam, do you want to be the nuclear pessimist or?
I think it's an important question to put out
It
there.
is, it is.
Yeah.
Sam, you go first and then.
As someone who works at some place that's called the Center for Nonproliferation Studies, I'm happy being the nuclear pessimist. So I think that Ken Waltz makes a couple of very good arguments, one of which is that often the fears about states acting irrationally and being unable to participate in deterrence relationships is often very kind of like ethnophobic or racist, right? Like this is something that emerged when China acquired nuclear weapons in 64. It's something that was worrisome when North Korea was proliferating, when South Asia was proliferating. But the idea that, like, wait a second, non-white people can act rationally and do deterrence? And the answer is yes, of course they can. Um, but and so I think that's something that Ken Waltz, makes perfectly clear. But I think that one of the criteria for the kind of Waltzian argument about how more powers produces more stability in regards to nuclear weapons, because everyone is afraid to move, is it's predicated on those arsenals being safe and secure and reliable, right? If those arsenals are vulnerable in the way that kind of Iran has demonstrated itself to be vulnerable, then it actually creates a lot of propensity for miscalculation and incentives for escalation. So a scenario in which Iran has a nuclear weapon, Israel is even more motivated to strike early and strike first and strike hard. And I think that that's a really worrisome situation. There are all sorts of other kind of follow-on things to that. Command and control is very important. And, it's unclear whether or not the Iranians have that level of kind of institutional organizational culture in their military. Right. So much of the IRGC is plagued by corruption and scandal. And so, of course, every military is, but I'd be really worried about all of these kind of other things. But ultimately, I'm not sure it would bring stability because you kind of need that security in your arsenal. And I think that this has demonstrated that they don't have that.
Not to
Just,
mention,
no,
did you want
no,
to
you
say
go.
something, Rebecca? I was going to say,
No,
not
go
to
ahead.
mention that Saudi Arabia would want a bomb, and then Jordan would want a bomb, and then, you have a real potential for a regional race there. And again, the problem with nuclear weapons is also that just an accident, for example. And this brings me to another one of the audience questions. How the questioner says how practical, but I'm also thinking how dangerous is it for these countries to be investing and relying on nuclear weapons? I mean, thinking particularly of Israel, I mean, how can they use that weapon without literal blowback on their own population, as well as throughout the entire region?
I mean, there are ways to detonate nuclear weapons that produce a lot less fallout, but yes, I think it is important to emphasize here that nuclear explosions don't respect borders, right? Israel's a very small state, and I think that's why it's especially concerned about another country having nuclear weapons, right? There's not a lot of strategic depth in terms of the geography. Um, I'm glad you made the point, Allison, about where does it end? Like Saudi Arabia has said if Iran gets a bomb, I mean, it's said it on 60 Minutes, right? So I think that's where I come down with a lot of nuclear issues. It's like, how sustainable is this system we have now with the nuclear haves and the nuclear have-nots, right? When it was supposed to be temporary, can this continue? I also think that instability and insecurity coming from Israel is not just is or in the Middle East is not just because Israel has weapons. It's because some countries say they want to literally wipe Israel off the map. So I mean, they do feel an existential threat. I think if Israel's status, it could feel more secure in its status, that maybe the nuclear issue wouldn't be as relevant.
Which brings me to what I think will be our last question. And I know there's some really important questions here that I just want to mention that I think go beyond the scope of what we're talking about tonight, but are important. And that is the nature of the Iranian regime itself and other regimes in the region, the impact of chemical weapons. So as we know, not only did Saddam Hussein use chemical weapons on the Kurdish population, but the Iranian regime has certainly not been shy about using these on the Kurdish population and executing, their own citizens. And so I want to acknowledge those questions, but get to this last question here, which is there a way to restructure or recalibrate the nonproliferation regime so that it can include or address these nuclear halves who are outside of the recognized framework, like North Korea and like Israel, in a way that would sort of restore the credibility of that convention and perhaps get some of these reluctant states or nuclear aspirant states to come on board?
Right, that is a really difficult question. I mean, I don't think there are a lot of states out there advocating for nuclear disarmament. We have a nuclear disarmament treaty that over 70 states are a part of in the world today, and we're not going to get to a place of reducing nuclear weapons until all of the country's nuclear weapons can be brought under some kind of arms control and nonproliferation regime. The US isn't going to say, oh, we're obligated by the NPT to pursue disarmament, which they are, or they're not going to fulfill that, if India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea aren't included in that. And I think, again, that gets to the point, we might be satisfied with where we are now. The US has nuclear weapons. We might feel safe, or some people might feel safe, other people will not, but just how long can you maintain that without making a greater commitment to reduce nuclear weapons and to bring those other states in? I don't see it lasting another 50 years if the status quo is maintained.
Thank you for that, and thank you both for this fascinating, if not a little bit unsettling, conversation about the impact of these potential strikes. I really appreciate you both coming in on such short notice. We pulled this together very, very quickly and didn't give these two knowledgeable experts much opportunity to prepare, which I think shows the depth of your knowledge. So thank you, both of you, again, for being here tonight, and also for the work that you do and your efforts to inform the public and have a better informed public about the real risk of nuclear proliferation in the world. We will have another webinar in 2 weeks' time. I'm loosely calling it Iran, Israel, and the United States Part 2 because we don't have a title yet, but we have identified some speakers in Washington, and we're going to try to get sort of a U.S. government, a congressional view on the current crisis. That will be on July 9th. I also want to thank all of our sponsors, particularly Coffee by Design, our global benefactor. I want to thank the University of Southern Maine, our longest partner as the World Affairs Council of Maine. We've been working together since 1979, and they make this webinar possible and enable to do webinars in a way that we can keep it free for our members, free for student members, and at a low cost for anyone else who wants to sign on. My last thing that I want to say is we are in the process of our annual appeal. Our fiscal year closes on June 30th, and we're coming up against a bit of a budget shortfall. And so I want to ask respectfully everyone who came out tonight for this program to think about the value of these opportunities, the chance to hear from experts, including locally based experts in the privacy of your own living room, to come out to our program. And again, the importance of our ability to engage students in these learning opportunities, and consider stopping by our website and making a donation to help us close that year-end gap. So with no further ado, I want to again say thank you to everyone and wish you all the best of the rest of your evening. We have recorded this, so we will send out a recording to everyone who was registered, and it will soon be on our website. So again, thank you, and everyone have a good evening.